The idea is very simple. We are architects and we work for conviviality. And so please come around a table. The conversation that Lucia was mentioning earlier about the general ecology project is revolving around a very simple idea. And that is an idea that we might want to take a sample of the sediment of the Serpentine Lake. And the idea of taking the sample of the Serpentine Lake is a very banal idea. It's the easiest thing that you can do in terms of understanding the place we are in. But it has many consequences. First of all, it's not so easy to go out and take a sample of the sediment of the lake. You need permissions. And so part of the discussion with Lucia and Serpentine about general ecology is how to think ecology as a political gesture of connecting and changing the way we work by exchanging with different institutions around us. But we want to take the sample not only to somehow push royal parks to talk to Serpentine, or maybe talk to Imperial College or the V&A and the other institutions around the park. We want to take the sample of the sediment, basically mud, at the bottom of the lake, because most probably some parts of the lake have not been touched since its construction. I say construction because it's a constructed lake. It's a fantastic example of what we call an English landscape. It looks natural, but you know very well that it's man-made. It's probably never been touched. At least some parts have not been dredged. We know that during the various Olympic Games that London hosted, parts of it have been sort of cleaned up. Maybe there's some areas that have been even dredged. But most certainly, other parts have been stable. And because it's an artificial lake, the water doesn't move so much. So the sediment is rather stable. And there's an hypothesis that we might find in a very nicely layered way all the different strata that have accumulated over the last hundreds of years. 1730s is most probably the inception date of the Serpentine. Exactly like this stratification of Frida Escobedo's pavilion, the bottom of the lake is full of one layer after the other. That basically it's the silt that sediments on the bottom. And with that silt, basically the leaves that have been brought by wind onto the lake and so on, comes part of the atmosphere. So most probably, if we are lucky and the say historical research guides us to the right place, our friends and collaborators from our different scientific institutions that we collaborate with, that are joined in the Anthropocene Working Group, might be able to find a full record of industrialization in the very capital of industrialization, right in the middle of London, right in Hyde Park. In the middle of Hyde Park, next to the Serpentine Galleries, there's a lake, and at the bottom of that lake, most probably we can find the entire sedimentary record of industrialization. And this is what I wanted to somehow invite you now to taste and feel. What is that? What are we talking about? Why would we want to take muck from the bottom of the lake and try to conserve it? If I understand correctly, when the fantastic piece on oil by Christo was set up, the aim was also to clean part of the lake. And a lot of sort of rubbish was brought up with fantastic effort to clean the lake. And that, of course, moved the sediment partially. So most probably the top part of the sediment has been disturbed. But that is something that happens very often. You have amphibious creatures go down and things like this. And the fact is that even if we don't find a complete clean part, so to say, of the lake, we might find evidence of having somehow fiddled with natural processes in the stratification process that is, in any case, the marker of human activity on the surface of the planet. Today, we are doing an experiment of what that might entail. And we are very happy that Sissel told us embarked in this crazy idea of doing this thing together. And we organized our picnic around 5 moments, which are organized here both in the petri dishes and in the larger trays. We have the work of Francesca Sarti and her collaborators is organized in the bread, and it goes from sweet to sour, bitter, salty, and savory, and it's combined with another 5 little petri dishes, and these are all based on the possible stratification process that you might find at the bottom of the Serpentine Lake, but actually anywhere else in the world. Because what happens in chronological terms is that strata are always coetaneous. So if we find a strata today, the current strata is marking the same age all over the Earth. The strata is nothing else than the record of the history of our planet. So at every moment in its history, and the planet goes through very complex processes that produces strata. And this is where fossils come in. The 5 elements are figures of shift. We'll go through them as we taste and smell. The idea is that you should eat the bread and smell what is in the petri dish.
And chew properly.
Chew properly.
As you chew, you smell one of these petri dishes. By doing that, you kind of explore the chemistry of eating, which is a complex process, not only taste, but primarily also supported by smell molecules. So by digesting this neutral bread that have 5 directions of taste, and at the same time smell, as it appears as if you eat those components that's on the petri dishes. So really try to enjoy the process of digestion and close your eyes, chew properly, and smell one of the dishes.
And please don't eat the content of the petri dish. There is a limit to our liability. The idea, and this is the very simple hypothesis that is contained in this sort of crazy idea of going out in the Serpentine and getting a sample, is that we might actually find the transition from the Holocene into the Anthropocene geological epoch right in the middle of London. And if that would be the case, and it's not obvious, it could also be considered by the Anthropocene working group, who's accumulating all the evidence that we are now in a new geological epoch. It might be considered as the Golden Spike. The Golden Spike is the site where scientists will have to return to actually see the transition from one geological strata to the other. And in case they're not sure where their analysis lies, they have to go back to what has been agreed upon by the International Stratigraphic Commission, and they will see that's it. So we might have a situation where the golden spike of the Anthropocene is a few meters away from us. Fossils. How is all this connected to fossils? Anthropocene and fossils. Fossils are from the past. Why are we talking about the Anthropocene as fossils? You might imagine that the first idea or first encounter with fossils are really opening up all kinds of questions and problems. Are they just stones in the shape of fish, like lapides generalis, like they used to say, or are they actual organic in their origin? That question bothered completely the 16th and 17th century European mind. It is that very question about whether these stones that look like fish are the leftover of a banquet of pilgrims on top of a mountain, or the actual leftovers of fish but on top of a mountain. Where did the fish come from? On mountains? Where is the water? What happens to that? And that series of distinction, whether fossils are organic in their origin or whether they are plastic formations of say, the mineral realm of natural history, bothered people like Leibniz, like Giordano Bruno, like Robert Hooke, Descartes. The entire formation of the so-called scientific revolution lies not only on the Copernican reorganization of our position in the universe, at the margin of the universe, but our different concept of time, all around these little stones. We now know, because we live in the 21st century, 250 years into say geological science, that what is around us is a series of processes exactly the same as the ones that have shaped the Earth. You need to understand the history of the Earth only through the processes that you can detect around you. There's no catastrophism. There's no major transformation of the planet that comes from, say, upheavals. There's no miraculous flood that has brought these animals on top of the mountains. They are part of a mineralization process, which is not an alchemic process that transforms stones and mud into fish, or the other way around. They are also not, fossils are also not the markers of, let's say, very weird ideas of impurity of the created universe, because, of course, a lot of these animals that we see in the fossils are very different from animals and plants that we see around us. So where are those animals? Where are they alive? Have they disappeared? Are they gone in some other part of the world that we have no access to? Or have they become extinct? And extinction is a major feature of the entire study of fossils. But the hypothesis of the sample is a more simple one. It doesn't really require us to rethink the history or the dark abyss of time. The hypothesis is that we leave traces, that we are animals that build nests and tools. And these traces and tools are trace fossils. Exactly like the traces that a little animal will live on the mud that might become fossilized in stone, we leave traces. And the hypothesis is that the trace fossil of humanity is everything that is around us. And the aluminium planks above you are not existing in nature. They require so much energy to extract. You require so much energy to extract from the bauxite salts, the particular metals that we take for granted in aluminium. The constructions, actually everything in this beautiful pavilion is dead. The only thing that is alive are humans, most probably some bacteria that you carry with you, and that's it. Architecture, in its very conception, is based on the distinction between what is human and what is natural. There's nothing here that is natural. everything is man-made, and it's a trace fossil. So the hypothesis is that the trace fossil of humanity has completely changed the Earth. Not only we are leaving traces here and there, we are modifying nature through history, but we are modifying the cycles of the planet through our trace fossils. Cities, territories, industries, atmospheres are now the trace fossil of humanity. So this is what technically Peter Haff has called the Technosphere. The Technosphere is an hypothesis by Peter Haff that somehow resonates with the notion of the biosphere, the geosphere, and most notably the idea of the early 20th century by Vernadsky of the noosphere, that there is a succession in life from stones to life to knowledge. And the Technosphere is the hypothesis that our trace fossil, our spin-off from, say, our nests, and traces and holes and burrows are now so vast in magnitude and mass that they have become an autonomous system of the Earth. And this is the hypothesis of the Technosphere, which is in the central part of the idea of the Anthropocene. That our trace fossils, our cities, everything that we thought we were in charge of, tables, beautiful plywood, how do you glue together and bend things? Everything that we thought we were designing and shaping through our artful skills is now so vast that it's becoming what you might call a paradigm of the Earth. That is an autonomous system of the Earth that is shaping completely us. From within, we think that our trace fossil is just our product, so it's only an issue of deciding to do it better. There's an unfortunate idea connected to that, and that is that any attempt to do it better will simply add technology to the technological system. So we're just adding technology to the technosphere. But from the outset, it is self-organizing, so we are becoming more and more subservient to it. Actually, we spend so much time making sure that it works, rather than it works for us. So the Technosphere has now inverted agency, and this is the very simple hypothesis of going out and taking a sample of bottom of the lake in order to find the strata change, in order to get that. So this is the outset, and this is what we wanted to lay out today on the tables in hopefully tasteful way. I really would like to invite you all to start looking at the different elements that we have on the tables. We have 5 petri dishes, and they're organized as a succession. You start with the little tablets. So if you had a bad breakfast, you can eat these. This is just edible coal. They might help your digestion. It's the only thing you can eat from the petri dishes. The idea is that you mix the bread. Maybe you pass it along because it's really...
or you stay up and move around.
But let's start with the first tablets. This is coal. You can smell it.
Eat it.
Eat it, smell. It doesn't smell much. It's most probably you're probably overwhelmed by another smell that we'll come to in a while, which is a more deep smell. This is leaving you black fingers. Recently there was a meeting in the Australian Parliament where coal was passed around, and the Australian members of Parliament were intimated not to be afraid of coal. It does nothing to you. It's not dangerous. You can eat it. Actually, coal is just, biomass, and going through a process of transformation, basically extracting the carbon from the biomass that has been turned into biomass by photosynthesis. Yeah? This is nothing else than the result of the fact that we have life on our planet. Without plants that take energy from the sun and transform it into this, no life. So this is nothing else than a trace that our planet carries life. It's the only planet that carries life. The coal that you can eat is, of course, a trace fossil. In here, there's not actual animals and plants. It's just a trace fossil of the fact that there was life on the planet for millions of years. And for our human history, for most of our human history, we just relied on biomass for our energy consumption. We eat plants, or we eat animals that have eaten plants, or we give biomass to animals so that they can work for us. They can work the fields, they can make the entire agricultural revolution work for us. So the entire notion of the agricultural revolution, of becoming instantial, or becoming associated with a place that you cultivate, you take care of, is based on biomass, on the fact that there's life and we just eat it. The point is that at some point in our history, and it's a very European idea, there's not enough food, but there's a lot of will to be rich. And the food is in scarcity, but there's a possibility of accumulating food through provisions that are anticipating the future. And this is really the beginning of cities, as we know them. The 12th and 13th century explosion of the urban structures in Europe is nothing else than a reaction to the fact that we got less and less food. And we got less and less food for very complicated reasons of empire and the rise of, say, divisions between East and West, of what used to be called the ecumenical empires. So basically the rise of Islam and the unification of Islam blocks off the central part of the ecumenical empires that on one side has, let's say, a very muddy and rainy island like the one we are on now, and the other side has riches and floodplains and fantastic agricultural conditions. Europe undergoes, in the 13th century, a dip in food production. You no longer have access to spices, you no longer have access to commerce, and a few feudal systems stop being feudal. They gathered in cities, and you start seeing the rise of the communes, the rise of the city states, self-organizing provisions by dominating the countryside, actually by incorporating the country into the city. And it's the first idea of the Italian city, the Urbino, the Siena, and so on, are nothing else than small groups of people living in places like this one, where there's nothing alive, where there's no food, and dominating their countryside so that they can stay alive. They give, and the peasants will give them food. So it's a power relation based on only on one simple food or energy provision. On the table, there is a little sticker, a post-it in drafting paper. And actually there are two. The one on the left that you see is a graph. And this is a graph that is taken from the Global Energy Assessment compiled by IASA, which is the International Institute for Advanced System Analysis. And the Global Energy Assessment is nothing else than a huge exercise in science in understanding how much energy is humanity using every year. And every 10 years, there's an attempt to understand how much energy are we using. And this little graph shows basically the global energy consumption or transformation, because energy is maintained, of humanity. So you can imagine that since 1850s to now, we went from around 40 exajoules to around 600 exajoules of global energy consumption. There's not been any single species that has undergone such a transition in the history of the planet. Not even the great oxygenation of the atmosphere has seen a species dominate energy so much. Compared to our body mass, the amount of energy that humanity is consuming is 1,000-fold excessive. There's not been one single species that has gone this. So the question, of course, is whether we are still the same species as 1850. That's a corollary of the sample. The 600 exajoules are almost the equivalent of the net primary production of the biosphere. So everything that we take from the atmosphere, or that plants take for us from the atmosphere, we take from fossils. Because the biomass you see in that little graph still remains the same. We didn't manage to tap into, say, our planet's exposure to sunlight in order to take out immediately the energy that is arraying our planet. We have to tap into stored energy in the form of either gravitational pull, hydroelectricity plants, where you use the gravitational capacity of rivers, or a little fraction we've been managed to tap into atomic energy. You see it on the top. Renewables is almost unnoticeable in that line. It's just the thickness of the top line. But the big part of our energy consumption, our transition into being a new post-human species, is relying on carbon, stored biomass that has been compressed and expelled mainly from any other component just to retain the energy capacity of coal. The transition from the fluvial organizations of polities, the big Mesopotamic or Nile, or the entire notion of the Fertile Crescent polity of, say, the Holocene, into the city-state is a marker of a transition of energy. You move from using wood and plants to feed your animals and heat your rooms into a different use of energy, because the city-states need to get more and more food. They don't rely completely on the orchards around them. They need to accumulate food in order to exchange food at a different time. You start seeing a completely different polity organizing itself, and that demands more energy, which of course is extracted not by cutting down trees and burning them, but actually digging and getting coal. So in the second little graph, you start seeing the same data organized in relative terms. No longer in exajoules on the vertical axis, but percentage, 100% of energy. And you see that at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, almost the totality of our energy comes from biomass. Now, there's a few mills, a few windmills, but almost the totality of global energy consumption, not Western, global energy consumption comes from biomass. And by the beginning of the 20th century, that has been changed into coal. You have a huge transition. You go from relying on small groups of people governing themselves in communes, in municipalities, taking decisions about the future through the invention of very complex methods of calculations and provisions, and most probably even capitalism in order to accumulate. You go into a situation where that organization needs to be structured in a far larger way of dealing with resources, with coal, again, biomass. And this is where I would really like you now to start tasting the bitter, and the sour, and the savory, and smelling the second petri dish, which is the coal splinters. This is actually anthracite. Yeah, you can actually pass on and share the flavors. I think
just stay up. It's more easy. You don't move around. Anyway, I've done a lot of research in Svalbard concerning this issue of coal for several years. The mine Svea started in 1907 and closed definitely in 2017. I got access to the mine in 2004 and collected small molecules emitting from the deep 120 meter down, replicated it through chemical compounds, and what you have here, the second or the third petri dish, is the replicated smell of the mine where the anthracite was found. So the anthracite is from exactly the same spot. So this is a decontextualized coal mine from the North Pole, what you're smelling, and maybe, you know, the only thing left from that mine. So it's a kind of an artifact of a, you know, of a very important kind, and yeah, preserved sites under the earth. Now this mine is turned into, among other, a seed bank, which you probably all have heard about. So they are trying to put different functions into this previous mine.
the seed bank is an initiative of the International Rice Institute, which is one of the institutes that was set up during the so-called Green Revolution, the inception of which is linked to the Ford Foundation, to ameliorate the capacity of farmers to produce. Basically, to eliminate famine, you need to increase productivity. And in order to increase productivity, you have to revise completely the structures of property of land in order to have much larger farms. And you have to revise the particular rice that you are going to plant. You have to revise the particular way of fertilizing the plants. And what you actually see is coming in DDT in order to take away the vermin, the entire possibility of having people work in those areas, not suffer from malaria. But you also start seeing the push of the so-called Haber-Bosch process, which is a process that takes and extracts nitrogen from the atmosphere through a very complex industrial process that adds energy to atmosphere in order to separate the nitrogen and create fertilizer. The energy of the Haber-Bosch process usually comes from the refineries associated with the extraction of petroleum. And this is the next energy transition that you start seeing in the graphs. And you start seeing the very weird thing that on one side we have a great acceleration of energy use, but on the other side we start seeing these passages from wood to coal to oil, and now to gas, atomic and renewable. Each one of these transitions is significantly a marker of what is called by economists the tragedy of the commons, the fact that we use only one resource at a time, and once we've finished it, we move on to the next one. We don't manage to somehow regulate multiple sources. But it's also a marker of a polity transition. You go from city-states to bureaucracies and parliamentarian states to the international. The rise of the acceleration after World War II is linked with to a new form of energy management, mainly the atomic energy, but also the transition from coal being a sovereign body into it being a shared part of sovereignty with the rise of the European Union, or what used to be called the European Economic Community, or the steel and mine community at the beginning of the 1950s. The transition is marked by the third petri dish, which is British. It's not from Svalbard. It's from Dorset. It's the petroleum. It's actually crude oil from Dorset. It doesn't smell so much, and that has to do with the fact that in Dorset, I'm not 100% sure where the sample is taken from, but I guess it's from Poole, which is the largest oil well, land-based oil well in Western Europe, in Poole. It is a little bit sour. It has a lot of sulfur in it. And what is interesting is that the way through which we classify oil is sweet to sour, depending on the sulfur content. So sweet spots are what we encounter when we think of the connection between oil and finance. Petroleum, this liquid sample, is not only a liquid form of energy, it's a liquid form of power, of political power. It's intruding on our life everywhere. It is probably even more than liquid. It is ubiquitous. The way through which petroleum and its derivatives have become everywhere is not only to be found in the say plastics dominating the seas, or the fact that we are completely dependent on oil production or storage in order to run our economies. It is to be found, for instance, in the fact that we have no images of the oil spill of BP in the Gulf of Mexico, because BP made a special arrangements that no images of the consequences of the spill could be broadcasted. It is to be found in the almost incredible open door access of exponents of the oil industry to Downing Street. And not only Downing Street, every single country in the world has directly connection to the oil industry. So what happens is that as we accelerate our use of energy and we transition from one energy system into a new polity system, we're now also encountering a very bizarre situation. We want to think that the polities that are organized around energy are linked to materials in a completely different ways. We attach ourselves to structures in a completely different way. And this way, I would like to bring you to smell ozone, which is the last white set of beads, and maybe have something sweet with it. Ozone is O3. It's oxygen. Ozone is, of course, what you smell every day in the streets of London because of pollution. It's one of the outcomes of combustion engines. The ozone concentration at the lower elements of the lower say elevation of the atmosphere, the so-called critical zone, just above the canopy of trees, all the way down to the humus that keeps the world as we know it alive, is increasing through combustion engine. But in the top of our column of air above us, it's decreasing. And this was the major discovery of Paul Crutzen. Paul Crutzen is a fantastic scientist from the Netherlands who, in the 80s and 90s, endeavored to study the depletion of the ozone layer in particular by combining observations of Antarctica with his understanding of the entire chemistry of and the chemical reactions in the atmosphere. So you cannot have too much, but you cannot have too little. Ozone is really the marker, and this smell is the marker of a hero, Paul Crutzen. He's not only the hero because he discovered the chemistry, and he got the Nobel Prize for this, of that lies at the basis of the depletion of ozone layer that led through his personal efforts to the Montreal Treaty that banned CFC gases. But he's also the hero because in 2000, in the year 2000, while he was presiding a meeting of the International Geosphere Biosphere Program in America, stood up and told off the chair of the meeting that was referring to the particular processes of life, the biosphere, in relationship to scientific work done all over the globe in order to understand the relationship between life and the atmosphere and the geosphere, and said, actually, what you're referring to, your baseline to refer to all these processes, the Holocene, is no longer present. Wherever we look, wherever we measure, wherever we survey, we see transformations. We see a trace fossil of humanity having changed completely the composition of forests into plantations, having changed the composition of mammals and vertebrates on the planet. There's so little wild animals. There's a majority of, say, domesticated animals, domesticated plants. We have seen the transformation of erosion patterns. We've seen the transformation of the carbon cycle. We've seen the transformation of the nitrogen cycle. We are now in the Anthropocene. So what we hope is that by you smelling the ozone, which is a very usual smell that you find, is that you can maybe bring with you the idea that Anthropocene is not an idea, it's a smell. It's something that enters your body. And that particular relationship with the earth is so much you that no matter what you think, you'll still smell it. This is where we wanted to somehow show you that the joviality of sitting around the table might be also nasty. And so, nasty. So the intimation is simple. Keep oil in the ground. Thank you.